that drive? Well, I don't have a pointer, and my linkage is sloppy, so I really can't tell, aside from feel, roughly what gear I'm in. Here we go, moving backwards a little bit. So that must be reverse. 2 notches down. No, it's not drive. Okay, another notch down. But that's where second should be. And there's where first should be. Where are my notches? Where are my gears? Here we go, that's neutral. And that should be reverse, that's reverse. Should be drive. That's not drive. Alright, what have I got? I got sloppy linkage. Thankfully, there's a fix for that. So come along, I'll show you what we're going to do. Fix that sloppy linkage. There are actually 2 sets of linkage that need to be adjusted for the Torqueflite 727 in my 1987 Jeep J-20. The first one is the line pressure linkage. This piece that connects to the carburetor, that goes back to a pivot on the back of the block, and that is supposed to move freely. This spring helps it move back to its resting position, but that linkage goes down. I don't know if you can see that. Let's see if we can get a light on the situation. It goes down the back of the block and there we go. Activates linkage that connects to a rod on the top of the transmission. If this is frozen or does not move freely, then your transmission won't know where your throttle is and it will not shift properly. You can possibly ruin it. The second linkage, looking over here, underneath the brake booster, past that wiring connector, is the linkage that goes from the transmission column down to the transmission itself, and that's the shift linkage. That has a pivot, 2 pivots in fact, and then some bushings, and when that gets worn out, as this one is, you don't know which gear you're in. It doesn't match up. There's a lot of slop between the gear shift lever inside the cab and the actuator arm on the transmission. So, to remedy that, we've got ourselves a couple of kits. First one, 727 Linkage Repair Kit. It's for the shift linkage. This one's from BJ's Off-Road. It includes bushings, it includes a new pivot, includes bellows, and a second one, since there is no kit for the line pressure linkage, is just a general purpose Dorman kit with a variety of bushings, one of which should work for our linkage. All right, I'll take you underneath and show you the slop in the system. Okay, let's come over here and look at this pivot. This pivot right here moves around a good deal. All that motion between the shift column, the shift on the column, and the linkage at the transmission will cause it to act sloppy. You won't know exactly which gear you're in. So the solution, take it off and repair it. Replace the worn out bushings, replace the worn out pivots, put it back together, and adjust it according to the specs. Okay, after a lot of struggle, I got this linkage out. It's only attached in a few places, but the few places this one was attached were rusted solid, were tough to pop out. So, the linkage down here for the transmission line pressure goes into a bushing like this. That's worn. This goes into the transmission shift lever. It gets activated by the column. Well, how about I clean all this up and then show you how it should look in proper working operation. Let's give that a shot.
Now that I've cleaned up all the linkage, I can show you what it looks like outside of the car and show you the relative operation of each of the pieces. So the first thing to look at is the gear shift linkage itself. It consists of 3 pieces and a couple of pivots. The first piece is the rod that comes down from the gear shift lever on the steering column. That moves up and down as you shift the transmission from park to drive and so forth. That connects to this bell crank with this bushing right here, and it's just a bushing. It doesn't capture this rod, so the rod requires a washer and a cotter pin to hold it in place. This bell crank goes into a bushing here on this bracket that bolts to the front of the bell housing, as well as a bracket that is bolted to the frame. Now, BJ's kit comes with an upgraded bearing that slides onto that shaft, but it also has a seal, and beyond that it has bellows that keep dirt from getting into this bearing. So in principle that ends up being sealed up, and that's your pivot. And what that moves is this rod that connects to the lever on the side of the transmission. So you shift into drive, it pulls that lever forward. You put it in park, it pushes that lever backward. There are 2 bushings for the cross shaft. Like I said, BJ's has an upgraded version for the outer part of the shaft. They don't include anything for the inner part of the shaft. So what you do is you go down to your local Lowe's and buy yourself a Hillman part number 880448. It's a 1 inch by 3/8 inch by 3/8 inch nylon spacer. You shave down the outer edge, so you put a little chamfer on it, and then you tap it into the housing that used to hold a bushing like that. That bushing, that's complete garbage. So you can see that moves all over the place, whereas this one will allow the shaft to rotate, but doesn't allow any fore, after, up, or down movement. So between those 2 pivots, replacement pivots, you'll have nice tight bell crank operation. There are 4 other connections. 2 of them are bushings. The original bushing is just a plastic bushing that pushed through the hole, and the lever is attached to it via a cotter pin and a washer. BJ's includes the following bushing. Let me show you what it includes. It includes 2 of these black bushings. But these black bushings are designed for a different kind of connection. They're designed to go in here. You can see they would basically snap into place. But these have a lip inside, and these are designed, like the one for the transmission lever that comes out of the transmission case itself, to pop into this kind of bushing where there's a raised section inside the bushing that captures this groove. There is no groove on this side. So I'll show you how to modify these bushings to work with this style. Maybe on some vehicles, this inner link at the bell crank does have this type of connection, but my 87 J-20 did not. Here's the bushing modified to accept that kind of connection. And this actually is the connection, the same kind of connection for the adjuster pin on the rod coming down from the shift lever itself. You can see I've modified it so that this pin fits tightly through it, and then I put a washer on it and put that cotter pin through it. It locks it in place. That's the same kind of connection at the top. BJ's doesn't include any bushing for the top of the shift lever. So, my Dorman kit does. It includes a bushing, but again, for a different style connection. It includes a bushing designed for something like this, but this uses the cotter pin. So I'm going to modify this bushing in the same way I modified this bushing to work with the cotter pin style connection. BJ's does include a bushing that I'm guessing goes on the arm on the transmission case that this would pop into, that would capture that groove. We'll give that a try. The one on my case is already pretty tight. It was fun getting this out of there, but I'll see if this one will work just as it should. You can tell a little bit, there's a little bit of play in this bushing that's there. In the bushing that I've put in now, there's no play whatsoever. Between the play that adds up at the bushing at the top of the shift lever rod, the bushing here at this connection to the bell crank, the connection here for the lower rod to the bell crank, and the connection to the lever, plus the slop that occurs when these bushings wear out. Between all that, you can tell where all the play comes in and where the vagueness of the shift lever originates from. So with these new bushings, all that is going to be taken care of. Let me just show the operation of the kickdown, or more properly speaking, throttle valve linkage that connects to the carburetor. There's this rod that bolts to the arm on the throttle. There's an adjustment procedure for adjusting it properly. We'll go through that later. It connects with a bushing, or more properly a retainer, to the top of this rod, which has two pivots. One pivot at the top, which bolts the back of the left-hand side cylinder head, and another pivot at the bottom that bolts to the front of the transmission bell housing. And then there's a rod that goes back to the throttle valve lever on the transmission itself. So you can see when you step on the throttle, this will pull forward and this will push this lever backward. This has to move freely because there's a spring that fits between here and this lever at the top. And this spring keeps tension on this so that when you step on the throttle, it pulls forward even at part throttle. So the bushings in this system, they don't really hold tightly. They don't have a lot of slop, but what they do, and you can see there's a third type of connection which is different from the type of connection for the transmission shift linkage. This has a groove. You can see that groove that captures the raised ridge inside this bushing. This doesn't have a groove, but rather it has a taper. And the kind of bushing or retainer that Jeep uses in 3 locations on this linkage has little teeth inside that hold on to the groove right down there. So these go down, and there's little teeth that, or little fingers that grab. You can't really see them on the inside of this, but there's fingers that grab onto that linkage and keep it in place. You see it's rather loose, and that's by design because this has to move freely. So you don't want a lot of friction between the retainer and the arm itself. There is one different one. There is one bushing at the bottom that is not going to have fingers on it because this just sits right inside that bracket. It will just pivot. There's another pivot that's not serviceable right at the top here. It's swaged onto this rod. There'd be no practical way to replace it short of rebuilding this rod. You can tell they put it on before this end was expanded or before this arm was welded on. So that has to be cleaned up and lubricated as best as possible. Alright, that's the operation of the 2 linkage systems for a Torqueflite 727. The bushings are all replaceable. BJ's has, well, the bushings are all replaceable, but these retainers, I can't find them. If anyone knows where you might find these retainers, put a comment in the comment box. I'd really appreciate it, because these kind would put too much friction and would prevent this from moving freely. Now that wouldn't, I could probably get it on, wouldn't get it off, and it really wouldn't work well for this operation. Because this is a square-shouldered groove to work with this square-shouldered groove in this pin. This is not a square-shouldered groove. It's got a taper, so it just is retained by this bushing.